All right, class, this is exciting. It's the last lecture of the semester, and it's going to be on Theodicies, and we will do that using Dostoevsky as kind of a framework or lens to talk about what it would take to have a successful theodicy. So first of all, remember a theodicy is an attempted solution of the evidential problem of evil. It is trying to explain basically a plausible reason why evil is not gratuitous. And so the first thing a theodicy has to do, and you might want to keep track of these, it has to explain some suffering as necessary, that is logically entailed by a greater good. So it has to identify a greater good and explain why that would entail suffering. Notice, before we get too far into things, that I said some evil. And this is kind of a pretty common misconception we should get rid of right away, is that a theodicy does not need to explain all evil. And so let's just talk about what a theodicy needs to do. So, why is that the case? Some philosophers of religion who are actually theists compared the theodicies to leaky buckets. And you might ask, will a single leaky bucket hold water? Well, of course not. If you stack up several leaky buckets, will they hold water? As long as the hole's not in the same place. And so, start this way. What does a theist need to do in terms of defending theodicies? To solve the evidential problem of evil, the theist must defend some number of theodicies, between one and who knows, such that when you put them all together, they explain all actual evil as necessary rather than gratuitous. That's what you would need to do to be a theist who can say that the evidential problem of evil has been solved. So again, you'd have to have some number of theodicies that explain all evil as necessary rather than gratuitous. If you could do that in one theodicy, fine, but very few people think you could. And that's where these helpful distinctions that we introduced in terms of types of evil in the first video between moral and natural evil are very helpful, because some people will appeal to one theodicy to explain moral evil, a different theodicy to explain natural evil, which we'll get to. So that's thing one. Thing two, the more interesting question, how many theodicies should you defend? The answer should be the same if you're a theist or an atheist. The answer is as many as you find plausible. If you find some theodicies plausible but not other, you should defend the plausible ones, etc., etc. So, now to be a theist, you have to find enough plausible to cover all. But that's kind of the general background. So, the second thing to mention is we're going to identify some theodicies, but also a lot of worries, and these worries must be addressed. And so I always like to say, theodicies are books, not bumper stickers. And so all we're doing today is talking some very general ideas. We are not going to solve the problem of evil today or prove it unsolvable. We're just going to talk about the general approach someone might take in these. So, to give you a little bit more background, the word theodicy was coined by Leibniz. Means roughly God's justice or God's defense. So, needs to explain evil as necessary rather than gratuitous. Let me add three more things that a theodicy needs to do in so explaining. First and foremost, it has to account for distribution. What do I mean by that? The distribution of suffering in the world. So let's start by talking about Dostoevsky. Here's a theodicy that Dostoevsky thinks fails for reasons we will see in a moment, but it was very common in Russian Orthodox Church in Dostoevsky's time. It's what you might call the punishment theodicy. The reason I'm suffering is because I'm sinful, and God is therefore punishing me. And so what does Dostoevsky's Ivan do to stop that line of thinking? He focuses all the suffering entirely on children, because children are innocent. And so if children are innocent, they can't deserve suffering, which means if children are suffering, we know that that explanation is not the right one. And so that's an issue of distribution. So if the explanation for suffering was that God was punishing people for being sinful, we would expect more sinful people to have more suffering, less sinful people to have less suffering, but that's not the distribution we find. So one thing that every theodicy must do to become plausible is to explain evil as non-gratuitous, but also explain it in a way that covers the distribution. And that's actually a pretty hard one, as we'll see. The second one, also brought out through Dostoevsky, is it has to preserve God's morality. As a general rule, if that explanation wouldn't work for a serial killer, it shouldn't work for God. So Dostoevsky kind of brings this out when he's talking about the case during the Prussian War, where the soldiers were throwing the live infants in the air and catching them on the bayonets in front of the parents. Ivan says, "Look, if this is the system that the soldier and the mother must embrace and forgive each other in heaven, I just want no part of it." And so, more generally, if the theodicy commits us to a system of ethics and calling things good that we don't want to call good, and we just don't want any part of it, that's a failure of a theodicy. So it has to preserve God's morality. And I guess I'll say another word about that now, make sure to leave a third item here. At absolute minimum, we know that if there's a God of theism, it has different duties than us. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a man savagely beating a small child, I don't mean disciplining, I mean beating, I have a duty there. I have a moral obligation to either stop that person or call someone who can. You know who doesn't have that duty? God. Because if God wanted that person stopped, they'd be stopped. And so at absolute minimum, the theist has to say that God and humans have different moral duties and need some plausible account of that. You might hear it in terms of like creator versus created, etc. But to be plausible, the theodicy has to at least maintain God's morality in a plausible way. The third thing a theodicy has to do in order to be plausible is to account for degree. People forget that goods and bads always come in degrees. The theist has to say this is the perfect degree of suffering for that good. And that'll come up as we see as we get into these theodicies as well. So to summarize, a theodicy has to explain why some suffering is necessary rather than gratuitous. In order to be successful at that, it has to do so in a way that is plausible, which means it accounts for distribution, it accounts for and preserves God's morality, and it accounts for and explains the degree. That's why they become books, not bumper stickers. Those are not easy. So, the other thing to remember when you've been Googling, there's a lot of things that are called theodicies that are absolutely not theodicies. And this goes to important for your academic career because it's a very common mistake on the final exam. Don't confuse what it would take to solve the evidential problem of evil with what it would take to solve the logical problem of evil. Remember, as we talked about in the first video, to solve the logical problem, I need to talk about what's possible. To solve the evidential problem, I need to talk about what's probable. So let me give you an example of one that kind of fails as a theodicy, but comes up as called a theodicy for stupid reasons. Sometimes called the Satan theodicy. How does this go? Well, God gave free will not only to humans, but to certain powerful entities, such as angels, One of them likes to kick the shit out of the world on a regular basis, and therefore explains a natural evil. Let me say two things about this. First of all, why does this fail as a theodicy? Because remember what we're doing right now. We're trying to figure out if we should believe in a God or not, which means we can't help ourselves to already believing in a God and therefore allowing us to believe in Christian holy texts that convince us that there is such a being. So unless we have very good independence, independent of a God, reason to believe that there is such a being as Satan, then that's just an account of what's possible rather than what's plausible. Hence, it's a defense in disguise, an attempted solution at the logical problem rather than evidential. That's also a good example, though, of preserving God's morality. Well, the other reason that fails is you say, well, wait a minute. It seems that we as humans don't do anything wrong in locking up criminals so as to prevent them from doing harm to themselves and others. We, in fact, have that duty. So one might ask, well, why wouldn't God have the duty to do that? So that might be an example of how we have to be careful about morality as well. But the more important point is, if we're talking about what's supposed to be plausible, independent of whether we know whether there's a God or not, we can't appeal to revealed texts. A second one that does this as a failure of theodicy, but might be okay as a defense, is one called the fall. So this is based on the Christian interpretation of Adam and Eve, where after original sin happens, God curses the earth and we'll stop being vegetarians, and humans have to start working the earth to get food now, and all of this stuff. Again, remember we are in a position where we don't know if there's any kind of God or not yet, which means we can't accept, revealed word of God from a holy text as evidence to try to prove that there's a God. That would be circular. However, if you want to use that as an account of what's possible, that would be okay. So once again, even though it's called a theodicy, that's clearly intended as a defense trying to solve the logical problem of evil rather than the evidential problem of evil. So the evidential problem of evil we have to do independent of revealed sources in a way that is independently plausible. Once we restrict our scope in that way, there tend to be the big three. You might want to make a little chart in your notes about what the theodicy is, how it runs, what evil it covers, and worries. And again, I put the word worries as things the theist must address in order to render this plausible. I don't quite call them objections. So let's start with one I mentioned in the first lecture, free will, except we'll do it as a theodicy this time rather than a defense. So the free will theodicy, how does this work? The claim is, well, there is this thing that's morally significant free will, seems valuable, seems important ethically, and yet, says the defender of the free will theodicy, morally significant free will must allow the choice between right and wrong to be morally significant, which entails the possibility of doing wrong and the suffering that includes. So, first of all, what evil does that try to explain? It tries to explain what we call moral evil. That is just stuff humans do. I mean, free will theodicy isn't going to say a word about Tay-Sachs or hurricanes. So, and it's not intended to. That's not a weakness, by the way. It's just a realization. So, okay, well, that's a bumper sticker. Why does this have to become a book? First of all, we have to explain the big three. Start with let's start with the issue of. Sorry, I forgot what order I gave them it. Let's start with the issue of God's morality. Well, wait a minute. If morally significant free will requires that we could choose to do wrong, that means that God doesn't have morally significant free will. because God is essentially morally perfect, if you recall from the description, which means God cannot choose wrong in an important sense, which means we'd have to explain, well, if this thing is so wonderful, why is it that humans have it and God doesn't? There's a couple of chapters. As always, we also have to talk about distribution. Well, the baby getting bayoneted certainly never gets to exercise their free will. So that seems like you have to say something about, well, why is why is the free will of the soldier so important that they can take away the free will of the infant? So that's going to be some time too. And then don't forget degree. You always have to have degree. So does free will come in degrees? Sure. I am perfectly free to lift 200 pounds. I am not free to lift 2,000 pounds. So free will does come in degrees. And what limits our free will? If you think your free will is unlimited, feel free to levitate. No? What's limiting your free will there? Laws of physics, laws of nature. So what does that tell us? That if there's a God who is morally perfect, that God limits our free will through the laws of nature. Theist has to say that. But wait a minute. Now I have to ask then, well, why is this limit to my free will the perfect amount? So, pardon the grotesqueness of the example, but we do have to talk about these sometimes. William Rowe, who does a lot on the evidential problem of evil, talked about an infamous case in Michigan where a little girl was literally raped to death. So, why do we need to be able to do that with our free will? Wouldn't it seem like a better place if the laws of nature were such that men simply physically could not do that, to rape a little girl to death? If you say it seems like the world would be a better place that way, then we have too much free will in a sense. We have not achieved the perfect degree, which means there's still gratuitous evil. So you, as always, have to say something about the degree and why this is the perfect degree of that good to suffering. Interestingly enough, the free will theodicy also carries one other big problem. Most ethicists think it doesn't work, and that's for the following reason. The choices, we don't have choices between just right and wrong. We usually have choices between right, wrong, and a middle category called neutral, which is neither right nor wrong. The defender of the free will has to deny that. They have to say, no, no, no. Why? Well, suppose I'm choosing between two options. One is good and one is neutral. Such as spending all day volunteering for Habitat for Humanity or spending all day watching football. Does it seem like that choice is morally significant? It sure seems like it. It seems like the choice between doing a bunch of good and doing a bunch of nothing is morally significant. And yet, the defender of the free will theodicy has to deny that, because then we don't need to be able to choose to do evil in order to have morally significant free will. So there's it commits you to a kind of kooky system of ethics too. Moving on. Second of the big three is what you might call the regularity of the laws theodicy. You get different names for it online. I just like regularity of the laws. How does this go? Here's a funny fact. If we'd have done one unit this semester, I sometimes do it, would have really established it well. Do you realize that knowledge requires regularity? We could learn literally nothing about the world if the laws of nature were not regular. So, for instance, suppose we lived in a world where when a ball rolls off a table, it falls at 9.8 meters per second, but when an infant rolls off the table, they gently float to the ground. That is, we didn't have regular laws of gravity. If we didn't have regular laws of gravity, could Newton have discovered the universal laws of gravitation? No, which means we'd have lost all the goods that came with that. Air travel and building buildings that are more than a few stories tall, etc., etc. Lost tons. Or to go back to the gruesome case I gave last time, the Tay-Sachs example, suppose the naive theist with their omnipotence wand waved away Tay-Sachs. And then suppose a few years from now, scientists are this close to a perfect description of the laws of genetic recombination, and they're looking at things really closely, and a scientist says, wait a minute, if we were right about these laws, there should be this odd defect that happens one every 200,000 cases. But we're not seeing that. I guess we're back to the drawing board. So because you waved your omnipotence wand without thinking it through, you basically destroyed all the good that could come of having knowable, predictable, complete laws of genetic recombination. So that is the regularity of laws theodicy. Basically, knowledge of the world is a good thing, but that requires regular laws. Notice that covers natural evil. That is, and only natural evil. So, that's, again, not a weakness. That's just recognizing what it is and what it isn't. But as always, to be plausible, you've got to talk about these kind of things. Well, first of all, you really have to talk about degree, and this goes back to Hume's 4 circumstances accounting for most evil, is, well, now you have to tell a story about why these laws are the best laws. Because the Theodicy says we have to have regular laws. Nothing about it says we have to have these laws. So think about the case I gave last time about if we could change the laws about when someone dies of hypothermia in water. You have to say those are the best laws. So that's a really tall order, is to try to explain why these laws are the best. That seems tricky. And so that's going to take a few chapters. There's also, again, kind of a worry about, well, why couldn't God just give us knowledge of the natural world? You'd have to say something about that, etc., etc. There's an extra interesting ramification of this. If it's God's job to allow regularity, you've also just kind of canceled revealed religion, because you basically said that God's doing something wrong in interfering with nature. So you have to get rid of miracles, prophecy, divine inspiration, and therefore revealed texts. So that's a problem too. The last of the big 3 is called the soul-making theodicy. This is defended contemporarily by John Hick. He cites Irenaeus. But here's the general idea, is that we are still developing. And the claim is that certain morally valuable attributes are best developed through adversity. So what does that mean? Is courage a good thing? Sure, seems like it. But you cannot have courage if you've never been afraid, if you've never been in a situation where you had something to fear and had to overcome that fear. And so certain attributes are best achieved through adversity. Notice I say best achieved, because, well, theoretically God could wave an omnipotence wand and make us courageous, but the claim is that there's something morally valuable about earning it instead. So, and that seems okay overall. Now, if that's successful, it can theoretically explain natural evil and moral evil, because both of them are causes of adversity. But the soul-making theodicy specifically hits some of these problems really hard, the big 3. First of all, okay, if courage is best developed through adversity, that means that human courage is better than God's courage, etc., because whatever attributes God has were not developed through adversity. And so, once more, we have to talk about, well, why are human and divine ethics so different? You also have to talk about distribution. Again, the infant who's getting bayoneted is never getting the chance to develop those virtues. And so we have to say something about the distribution. Um, Probably this of all the theodicies is the one that the ethics worry hits most of all, because this has just horrifying ramifications for ethics. If I really, really love my daughter, uh, that means I should make her life a living hell such that she can have the opportunity to develop all those wonderful character traits. And so the soul-making theodicy, more than any other, just seems to absolutely reverse morality. If I love someone, I should torture them, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. That's why theodicies have to be books, not bumper stickers. So be aware of the big three and roughly how they go and the kinds of worries we have to talk about, roughly. Don't try to memorize all this stuff. Just understand what theodicies need to do, and you should be able to evaluate a little on your own. There's also two other things I mentioned on the review sheet, mysticism and skeptical theism. I'm going to briefly mention those. They're not super important, but they're what you might call escapes, ways you might try to be a theist without actually solving the evidential problem of evil. The notion of mysticism is discussed at the beginning of part 11 of the dialogues. So mysticism is Hume's word there. And it's a position that Demian tries to defend. He basically says God is just good in ways we don't understand. And what's the worry there? Hume's Cleanthes, not even Philo, Cleanthes points out that just kills religion. To say God is good in a way you don't understand is functionally no different than saying God is schleb and worshiping God for being schleb. It just, you could say the words, but it doesn't mean anything. There's no important difference between not good and good in ways that you can't comprehend. So mysticism, the definition would just be to say that God's goodness is different than human goodness. That's different than saying God's duties are different. They're saying God's actual goodness is different. And that's the one that just destroys religion for Cleanthes. Skeptical theism is a different approach. And skeptical theism starts with something I mentioned many, many lectures ago, which is that evidence is total. And so theoretically, you might be able to do the following. Suppose I have really, 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 really good reason, independent of other considerations, to think there's a good God. That is, suppose there's a spectacularly successful cosmological or design argument that not only establishes a higher power, but makes it that higher power is very, very probably morally perfect. Suppose a very wildly successful argument like that, and then along comes the problem of evil. Let's numericize things to understand what they're trying to say. Suppose my mega awesome design argument makes me 99% sure that there is not only a designing God, but a designing God who is good. Along comes the problem of evil, and let's say that I don't think any of the theodicies are perfect, but they do take a lot of the threat away from evil. And so the problem of evil makes it less likely there's a God, but not spectacularly so. So let's say that in light of the problem of evil and the semi-success of the theodicies, I think that the problem of evil decreases the chance of a good God by 20%. Well, notice where you're at then. Put those two together, and numerically, you are 79% sure that there's a good God, which means you should tentatively be a theist. But what that also means, and this is where the word skeptical theism comes from, that means that if I'm 79% sure that there's a God, that means I'm 79% sure that there's no gratuitous evil, which means I might have reason to think that there's no gratuitous evil without actually knowing why the evil is necessary. So that's why skeptical comes in. I don't know why this evil is necessary, but if I have these independent reasons, I can maintain that belief consistently. But notice the problem there. So first of all, I'm not saying that the position is a failure, but I'm saying it's a lot of work because in order to defend that position, you have to give those reasons. You have to give those reasons to think there's a good God that overwhelmingly, not just a little, but overwhelmingly outweigh the challenge by the evidential problem of evil. So if you can do that, you can be on good grounds for saying, I don't know why this evil is happening, but I do have good reason to think that it's necessary. All right, so let's call that a semester, and we will see you at the review period.